Your four favorites are Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, Wild at Heart, Paris, Texas, and Nowhere. My top choice for you is Phantom of the Paradise. Like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, it's a 70s musical that blends together a variety of genres and inspirations that satirizes show business. I believe there's even a nod to Beyond the Valley of the Dolls in this movie. Like Wild at Heart, it's got rock music and violence. Like Paris, Texas, the main character is isolated and seems like a bit of an outsider. And like Nowhere, it's campy and the world feels surreal and artificial. One from the Heart has the melodrama and musical aspects of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls with the romance of Wild at Heart, but the fractured relationship dynamic of Paris, Texas. The stars of Paris, Texas are also in this movie, and it's very stylized with a lot of neon lighting like Nowhere. Badlands is about a couple of young lovers on the run like Wild at Heart. Like Paris, Texas, it's got this drifting across American landscape sort of feeling. Like Nowhere, it's about alienated youth, rebellion, and violence. And it's a 70s American movie like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Since Beyond the Valley of the Dolls is a musical and Nowhere has an incredible soundtrack and both films have queer characters, I want to recommend a couple musicals with queer characters that I think fit the vibe. And those are Hedwig and the Angry Inch and Velvet Goldmine. Branching off of that idea of queer characters and combining it with the road movie aspect of Wild at Heart and Paris, Texas, I think you might like My Own Private Idaho. Fuck Toys is also a bit of a road movie with queer characters, and there are aspects of this film that feel inspired by Russ, Meyer, David Lynch, and Gregg Araki, and you've got films from each of them in your favorites. Speaking of campy movies that feel partially inspired by Russ Meyer, I also think you'd enjoy Female Trouble. Liquid Sky, like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, is full of camp, sex, drugs, music, and fashion. Like Wild at Heart, there's some eroticism, violence, and hints of surrealism. Like Paris, Texas, there's a feeling of alienation. And like Nowhere, it's got queer characters, science fiction, and punk and new wave music. Zabriskie Point has that late 60s, early 70s counterculture vibe of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, with desert landscapes that emphasize the character's isolation like Paris, Texas. Like Wild at Heart, it has this feeling of being young and on the run. And like Nowhere, it's about alienated youth and rebellion, and it's got an incredible soundtrack. Speaking of movies that take place in the desert, I was surprised you didn't have Faster Pussycat Kill Kill marked as watch, since it's from the director of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. You praised the cinematography in Paris, Texas in your Letterboxd log, so I wanted to recommend another film from the same cinematographer. And he worked on Repo Man, which coincidentally, like Paris, Texas, stars Harry Dean Stanton in the desert. Harry Dean Stanton is also in Wild at Heart, and like that movie, this one's also a crime film. It's satirical like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, and like Nowhere, it's got science fiction and punk music. Speaking of Harry Dean Stanton movies, he's also in The Straight Story, which like Wild at Heart is a road movie directed by David Lynch. And like Paris, Texas, it's about a estranged family. Ladies and Gentlemen, The Fabulous Stains is about a group of young women in a rock band like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. Like Wild at Heart, Laura Dern is one of the stars. It's also a road movie like Paris, Texas, and it's got the alienated youth and punk music vibes of Nowhere. If you love the road movie and crime movie aspects of Wild at Heart and the estranged father-child relationship dynamic of Paris, Texas, then I think you might enjoy Paper Moon. Dinner in America has exaggerated characters, comedy, and a rock band like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. It's got the young lovers on the run angle like Wild at Heart and a lonely protagonist like Paris, Texas. And it's got the alienated, rebellious youth and punk vibes of Nowhere. This is an obvious one, but Nowhere is part of the Teenage Apocalypse trilogy, and I noticed you didn't have Totally Effed Up marked as watch, so I think that's worth checking out if you haven't seen it yet. Speaking of Gregg Araki movies, he's mentioned drawing inspiration from films like They Live by Night, which also has the melodrama of Beyond the Valley of the Dolls and the young lovers on the run dynamic of Wild at Heart. Party Monster has sex, drugs, fashion, and fame like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, with queer characters and a great soundtrack like Nowhere. In fact, both movies feature Stacey Q's song Two of Hearts, and like Wild at Heart, there's an element of crime and violence. Something Wild is a road movie like Wild at Heart in Paris, Texas, and it's got quirky characters like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls and Nowhere. And I also want to throw in But I'm a Cheerleader, which has camp, satire, exaggerated characters, and a colorful aesthetic like Beyond the Valley of the Dolls. It's got an element of forbidden romance like Wild at Heart, and like Nowhere, it's about queer young people who feel alienated from conventional society.